I thought deleting everything would end it. We changed the locks the same night everything escalated. We blocked every number we could find, saved screenshots, and promised ourselves we would not engage anymore. For a few days, it almost felt like life was returning to normal. But normal is a fragile thing when someone refuses to let go of you. The first sign came in a way I didn't expect. My husband noticed that his car door wasn't fully locked one morning, even though he was certain he had locked it the night before. Nothing was stolen, nothing was damaged, but something small had been placed inside the car. A folded piece of paper with no name, just a sentence written in a careful, almost calm handwriting. "You can try to forget me, but I don't forget you." That was when the feeling changed. It stopped being an awkward personal conflict and started feeling like something else entirely. We reported it. We showed the messages, the broken boundaries, the key she had copied without permission, and the strange behavior around our home. The officers told us to document everything and avoid contact, but I could see in their eyes that they were still deciding how serious this really was. The hardest part was that she wasn't a stranger. She was someone I had trusted for years, someone I had shared my life with, someone who had been present in every important moment I could remember. And now, I was being forced to rebuild every memory through a completely different lens. A few days later, while going through old files on my laptop, I found something that made my stomach drop. It was a hidden folder filled with photos of my husband. Not casual pictures from social media, but carefully collected images taken over time. Some were screenshots from events, others were photos where he was barely visible in the background, like she had been tracking him without ever drawing attention to herself. It didn't feel like obsession in the dramatic sense people imagine. It felt organized, patient, repeated. That night, we talked for hours. He admitted that he had always felt something slightly off around her, but he convinced himself it was harmless. The way she would sometimes focus too intensely on him, or how she seemed to remember tiny details he never thought were important. He said he ignored it because it never crossed an obvious line. Until it did. Then the silence began. No messages for several days, no unknown calls, no strange presence around the house. But instead of feeling relief, I felt the opposite, because silence like that doesn't usually mean the problem is gone. It usually means it's changing shape. And I was right. One afternoon, my phone rang from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. At first, there was nothing, just breathing on the other end, controlled and steady. Then her voice came through. She spoke like nothing had happened, like we were still normal. She said she just wanted to talk, to explain everything, and that I had misunderstood her completely. I told her there was nothing left to explain. She disagreed immediately, calmly, as if she was correcting a fact rather than arguing a feeling. She said I was the only thing standing in the way of happiness. That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else she said because it showed how she saw the situation. In her mind, this was never about boundaries or reality. It was about obstacles. After that call, things shifted again. We started hearing fragments of a different story spreading through mutual acquaintances. She told people we were unstable, that our relationship was failing, and that she was the one trying to help him. It was subtle at first, almost believable to someone who didn't know the full picture. That was what made it dangerous. Then came the confirmation that this had gone far beyond emotional fixation. We discovered a tracking device hidden in one of his belongings. Something small, easy to miss, but enough to give her access to our movements for weeks, maybe longer. That was the moment everything stopped feeling personal. We went back to the authorities with everything we had. This time the tone changed. They started treating it as a real safety concern, not just a complicated friendship situation. But before anything could move forward, she reached out again and asked to meet in person. We chose a public place, somewhere with cameras and people around. I remember sitting there waiting and feeling like I didn't fully know what I was about to face. Not because I was afraid of a scene, but because I no longer knew what version of her would show up. When she arrived, she looked exhausted. Not angry, not chaotic, just drained in a way that made her seem almost normal again for a moment. She apologized. She said she had been overwhelmed and misunderstood everything. For a brief second, it sounded like she might actually accept reality, but then she mentioned him again. She said he would eventually understand what they really were, and that he was just confused right now. That was the moment I realized nothing had changed at all. The language was softer, but the belief was identical. She still didn't see him as someone who had made a choice. She saw him as someone who would eventually be corrected. I told her directly that he didn't love her and never had. Her expression changed immediately, like something behind her eyes tightened. She told me I was wrong, that I was the one who had interfered, that everything would have been different if I hadn't been there. Then she stood up and said something that didn't sound like a threat at first, but felt like one anyway. She said she had waited long enough. And then she left. That night we got a message from her again. Just a few words. "I'm coming to fix this." And that was when we realized we were no longer dealing with someone who was going to stop on her own. After that message, we both understood that waiting for things to calm down was no longer an option. For days we had tried to convince ourselves that Mia would eventually realize what she was doing and step away. But every new discovery showed us the opposite. She wasn't moving on. She was becoming more determined. My husband and I spent the next few days trying to protect our privacy while also collecting everything we could. We saved every message, every strange interaction, and every piece of evidence that showed a pattern. Looking back, the most disturbing part was realizing how long this had been happening without us noticing. The things that once seemed like small coincidences started to feel completely different. There were moments when Mia would casually mention details about our lives that she shouldn't have known. She would know when we went somewhere, what we were doing, or what plans we had made privately. At the time, we always assumed she was simply paying attention because she was my best friend. Now we understood it was something much more serious. She wasn't just listening. She was watching. A few days later, my husband found something hidden among his personal belongings. It was a small tracking device that had been placed there without his knowledge. The moment he showed it to me, I felt the same cold feeling I had during the dinner when Mia first admitted she wanted to share him. This was no longer a situation between two people with complicated emotions. This was someone entering our lives without permission. We immediately contacted the authorities again and gave them everything we had collected so far. The messages, the copied key, the evidence from our house, and now the tracking device. This time the reaction was completely different. They finally understood that this wasn't just a friendship conflict. They told us to avoid direct contact with her whenever possible and to keep any future communication documented. They also told us that if she showed up again, we should not try to handle it ourselves. The strange thing was that even after everything, a part of me still struggled to accept it. Because I wasn't dealing with some random person. I was dealing with someone who had sat beside me during difficult moments. Someone who knew my fears and my secrets. Someone who had been part of my life for years. It was painful realizing that someone could know you so well and still completely misunderstand the boundaries between love, friendship, and control. Then a few days later, Mia contacted me again. She wanted to meet. My first reaction was to refuse. After everything that happened, I didn't want another conversation where she tried to explain something that couldn't be justified. But after talking with my husband, we decided that if we met her in a public place, with cameras and people around us, we might finally understand what she was planning. So we agreed. When Mia arrived, I barely recognized the person sitting across from me. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept properly in days. She wasn't angry or aggressive this time. Instead, she looked almost calm, which somehow made the situation feel even more uncomfortable. She started by apologizing. She said she knew she had made mistakes and that she regretted how everything happened. For a moment, I wondered if she had finally accepted reality. But then she started talking about my husband. She said she still believed he had feelings for her and that he was just afraid to admit them. She said she had waited patiently for years and that eventually he would understand what they were supposed to be. That was when I realized the apology was only a different approach. She wasn't letting go. She was trying a new way to convince us. I told her directly that he never had those feelings. I told her that kindness, friendship, and basic respect were not signs of secret love. Her expression changed when I said that. It was as if she wasn't hearing my words anymore. She started bringing up old memories, small moments from years ago that she believed proved there was something between them. She mentioned times he helped her, times he smiled at her, and moments when he was simply being polite. She had collected ordinary moments and transformed them into evidence for a relationship that never existed. The hardest part was seeing how real it felt to her. She wasn't pretending. She truly believed the story she created. Before leaving, she looked at me and said she had waited long enough. Her voice wasn't angry, but something about the way she said it made me feel uneasy. After she left, I sat there for a long time thinking about the past. I remembered all the times she defended me, all the times she acted like my closest friend, and I wondered how long she had been hiding these feelings behind a normal friendship. That evening, my husband received another message from her. It was short. There was no explanation, no apology, and no attempt to sound reasonable. She simply wrote that she was coming to fix everything. We immediately knew something was wrong. When I arrived home later that day, I noticed something strange before I even opened the door. It wasn't locked properly. I stood outside for a moment, trying to convince myself there was another explanation. Maybe my husband came home early. Maybe I had made a mistake. But when I checked my phone, I saw his message. He was still at work. My heart started racing. I called him immediately and told him what I saw. He told me not to go inside and to wait for him, but I already had a feeling that whoever was inside had been waiting for me. I slowly opened the door. The house looked completely normal. Nothing was broken. Nothing was missing. The silence almost felt intentional. Then I noticed a smell coming from the kitchen. Someone was cooking. I walked through the hallway, trying not to make any noise, and that was when I saw her. Mia was standing in our kitchen wearing an apron, preparing dinner as if she had every right to be there. When she saw me, she smiled. Not nervously. Not like someone caught doing something wrong. She smiled like she had finally arrived at the place where she belonged. She told me she wanted to show us what life could look like if we stopped fighting against what she believed was meant to happen. She said she wanted to take care of us and that everything she did came from love. I listened carefully because this time I understood something. Every word mattered. Every detail mattered, because this wasn't just about proving she was wrong anymore. This was about finally showing everyone what she had been doing. And when my husband opened the front door a few minutes later and walked into the kitchen, Mia looked at him like she had been waiting for that exact moment for years. Because she believed that once he saw everything she had done, he would finally understand. But she didn't realize one important thing. The person she had been trying to win over had never been confused. He had already made his choice. The house felt different after that night, like it had absorbed everything that happened and could no longer go back to being just a normal home. Even after the police had taken Elena away, even after the flashing lights disappeared down the street and the silence returned, nothing inside me relaxed. It was as if the air itself had changed density, heavier in places where she had stood, spoken, looked at us, like we were part of something only she understood. Leo moved through the rooms checking locks again and again, not because he thought it would change anything, but because it gave his hands something to do. I sat on the edge of the sofa staring at the kitchen doorway, replaying every detail from the moment she walked in with that calm smile, like she belonged there more than we did. The worst part wasn't even the screaming or the breakdown at the end. It was how certain she had been the entire time. Like reality was just something the rest of us were misunderstanding. For a while, we barely spoke. There was nothing left to say that didn't already feel contaminated by her voice. Eventually, Leo sat down beside me, exhausted in a way that sleep wouldn't fix, and told me that he kept thinking about all the small moments she had described earlier, the coffee shop, the beach, the party. He said he never noticed any of it at the time, but now he couldn't stop replaying his own memories, wondering how someone could take ordinary seconds of kindness and turn them into something else entirely. I understood what he meant because I was doing the same thing. I kept thinking about the friendship we had for years. Every conversation I thought had been normal. Every time she had smiled at me. Every time she had stood too close without me noticing. It all felt rewritten now, like someone had taken my past and edited it without asking. The days that followed were a strange mix of silence and procedures. We spoke to the police again, then to someone from a psychiatric evaluation team who asked the same questions in different ways, trying to build a timeline that made sense of something that didn't want to be logical. They asked about threats, about entries into the house, about the tracking. Every answer felt heavier than the last because saying it out loud made it real in a way that thinking about it never fully did. Her mother stayed in contact with us during that time. There was a kind of exhaustion in her voice every time she called, like she had been holding something back for years and only now realized how much it weighed. She told us Elena had gone through episodes like this before, though never directed so intensely at one specific person. She said therapy had helped for a while, medication had helped for a while, but something always pulled her back into fixation when she formed emotional attachments. Hearing that didn't make it easier. If anything, it made everything feel less like a sudden disaster and more like something that had been slowly building long before any of us realized we were part of it. One afternoon, a few days later, we were asked if we wanted to provide a written statement for a restraining order process. I remember sitting at the table with a pen in my hand, realizing how strange it was that paper could now decide the boundary between safety and fear. Every word I wrote felt inadequate, like language wasn't built for this kind of situation. How do you describe someone who didn't just cross lines, but didn't seem to recognize that lines existed at all? Leo read what I wrote and added his own details, quieter but more precise. When he finished, he pushed the paper forward and said he kept thinking about whether he should have told me about the messages earlier, whether that would have changed anything. I told him honestly that I didn't know, and I still don't. Some things don't change direction just because you see them sooner. That night we changed the locks again, even though they had already been changed. It wasn't practical anymore. It was psychological. A way to convince ourselves that control still existed somewhere in the system. We also installed cameras outside, not because we expected her to come back immediately, but because unpredictability had become something we were no longer willing to live inside of. A week passed like that, slow and tense, until the call came from her mother again. This time her voice was different, less controlled, more uncertain. She told us Elena had been evaluated and was going to be held for further treatment. She didn't use dramatic words, just clinical ones, but underneath them I could hear the same thing we had been carrying since that night: exhaustion and something close to grief. After the call ended, I sat outside for a long time watching the street. It looked completely normal, which somehow made everything worse. Cars passed, someone walked a dog, a neighbor watered plants like nothing in the world had shifted at all. But my internal world felt permanently altered, like I had crossed into a version of life where I could no longer assume safety meant absence of danger. Leo came out later and sat beside me without speaking. After a while, he said he felt guilty for not noticing how far it had gone earlier, even though logically he knew there was nothing he could have done without understanding the full picture. I told him guilt was just the mind trying to rewrite history into something controllable, but that didn't make it less real for him. We didn't talk about Elena directly after that for a while. Not because she stopped existing in our thoughts, but because she had started existing in a different category of memory, one that didn't fit neatly into conversation. Then one evening, much later than everything else, we received a letter. It wasn't dramatic or emotional at first glance, just a standard envelope forwarded through legal channels. Inside was a short handwritten note from Elena, approved through the facility. The tone was different from what we had heard before, less intense, more fragmented, like someone trying to step outside of a storm and describe it from a distance. She didn't apologize in a way that resolved anything. She said she was beginning to understand that what she felt had overwhelmed everything else, that it had turned into something that hurt people instead of connecting them. She wrote that she didn't fully remember certain moments clearly anymore, which scared her more than anything else. And at the end, almost as if she wasn't sure why she was adding it, she said she hoped one day she could think of us without feeling like the world ended. I don't know what I expected to feel reading it, but it wasn't closure. It was something more complicated, a recognition that she was still a person in a process that didn't end just because ours had changed direction. Leo folded the letter and put it on the table without saying much. Later that night he told me that forgiveness wasn't the right word for what he felt, but neither was anger anymore. It was just distance, something that time was slowly building where intensity used to be. And maybe that was the only real ending any of it could have. Not resolution, not understanding, not clean lines drawn between good and bad, but distance. The kind that makes it possible to breathe again without constantly listening for footsteps that aren't coming anymore. We never went back to the way things were before Elena. I don't think people ever really returned to versions of themselves that existed before something like that. But eventually, life started filling the space again in small, ordinary ways that didn't feel dangerous. Conversations about work, meals that weren't interrupted by fear, evenings where silence was just silence and not anticipation. And sometimes when I think about her now, it isn't the final night I remember first. It's earlier moments, the ones that seemed harmless at the time. That's what stays with you the longest, not the ending, but the point where everything still looked normal and wasn't.